Hey everyone, I'm Mr. StickScares. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the Appalachian mountains with 8 true, terrifying stories of feral people, encounters that prove sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods is human. Before we begin, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always chilling to see where you're listening from. Now, let's step into the shadows of Appalachia. Story number 1. I had been driving trucks long enough to know when my body was telling me it needed a break, but that night in 1980, I pushed on. I was hauling a load through Virginia, winding along back roads outside Abingdon, and the fog was thick enough to make me lean forward over the wheel as if that would help me see more. I wasn't spooked, just tired, and I remember turning the radio down because the static was starting to grate on my nerves. That's when I saw her on the side of the road. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17. Thin frame, pale face, long hair that looked damp like she had been walking a while. She was standing still, not even trying to wave, just staring ahead like she'd given up on anyone stopping for her. Normally, I wouldn't have picked up a hitchhiker, especially a teenage girl. Too much risk, too many stories. But something about the way she looked made me slow down. She seemed stranded, lost, and it didn't sit right to just drive by. I pulled over, leaned across the seat, and asked if she needed a ride. Her voice was soft, almost strained, when she said yes. She climbed in without hesitation, sat close to the door, and folded her hands in her lap. She thanked me, but kept her eyes down, and I noticed how quiet she was. Not shy exactly, more like she was carrying a weight too heavy for words. I asked where she was headed. She gave me a road name I half recognized, told me it wasn't far, just outside town. We rode in silence for a while. I tried making small talk, asked if she was from Abingdon, if she had family nearby. She gave short answers, nothing more. What stuck with me was how tired she sounded, as though every word cost her something. I didn't press. Something about her demeanor told me she didn't want to be asked too much. About 20 minutes later, I glanced over and realized she was staring out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. There was something unusual about the way she looked. Not frightening, not strange enough to make me alarmed, just off. Her face seemed too pale, her lips colorless, and her eyes looked hollow in a way I couldn't explain. I chalked it up to the fog outside, and my tired mind playing tricks on me. At some point, I looked back to the road for a stretch, focusing hard because the fog was growing thicker. When I turned my head again, she was gone. My heart jumped like I'd been shocked. I pulled the truck over, hit the brakes harder than I meant to, and looked around the cab in disbelief. The passenger seat was empty. No sound, no door opening, nothing. She was just gone. I threw the truck in park and jumped out, thinking maybe she'd somehow slipped out while I wasn't paying attention, though the thought made no sense. The road was empty. No footprints, no figure disappearing into the fog. Nothing but me, my truck, and silence. I can't explain the panic that set in. It wasn't like a horror movie where you expect something to leap at you. It was worse, the kind of panic that comes when something completely impossible just happened right in front of you, and you can't reason it away. I climbed back into the truck, my hands shaking on the wheel, and sat there breathing hard, trying to make sense of it. The rest of the drive into Abingdon felt unreal. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting her to reappear. My mind kept searching for explanations. Maybe exhaustion had made me imagine her. Maybe she slipped out somehow and I just didn't see. But the weight of the memory, the sound of her voice, The details of her presence were too vivid to be a hallucination. When I reached a gas station in town, I parked and went inside, needing to be around people, needing something normal to ground me. I told the clerk what had happened, leaving out the stranger parts so I didn't sound insane. I said I'd picked up a girl outside town, and she'd vanished from the cab. His face changed immediately. He asked me what road I was on. I told him. He nodded slowly, like he'd heard it all before, and asked what she looked like. I described her. Thin, pale, long hair, quiet. He didn't look surprised. He said, "You're not the first driver to pick her up." That's when my stomach turned. He went on to explain that years earlier, in the late 60s, a teenage girl had been killed in a car accident on that very stretch of road. She had been walking home from a school dance with her boyfriend when they were struck by a drunk driver. She didn't survive. According to him, for years since, drivers had claimed to see her walking the roadside, sometimes even picking her up, only for her to vanish before reaching her destination. I listened, every detail hitting me like a hammer. The road, her age, her appearance, it all matched. He didn't tell the story with drama, just matter of fact, like it was a local truth everyone accepted. Some avoided the road entirely at night. Others, he said, tried not to look when they drove past that stretch. I didn't sleep much the next few days. I kept replaying it, the way she sat in my truck, the way she spoke softly, the way she just wasn't there anymore. I tried to push it aside, tell myself maybe the clerk was spinning a local legend. But deep down I knew better. I knew what I had seen, who I had spoken to. For weeks after, every time I drove through the Appalachians, I carried a sense of unease, like I was part of something I didn't ask for. I never saw her again, though part of me half expected to. Sometimes I think she only appears to those who happen to be in the right place at the right time, people who she knows will stop for her. Years later, when I passed through Abingdon again, I found myself driving that same stretch, deliberately slowing as I approached the spot. I wanted to see her, as crazy as that sounds, not out of fear, but because I wanted to understand. But the road was empty, and all I had was the memory. I've told this story only a handful of times, mostly to drivers like me who know the long, lonely roads can hold things we'll never explain. It never feels like a ghost story when I tell it. It feels like a memory, something that actually happened to me, as real as any load I've hauled or mile I've driven. I've wondered often why she still walks those roads. Maybe she's trying to get home. Maybe she doesn't realize she's gone. Or maybe she just wants someone to acknowledge her presence. Whatever the reason, I'll never forget her. She wasn't a shadow or a trick of the fog. She was a girl who sat beside me, spoke to me, and then left me with the kind of memory that doesn't fade. People who haven't been out on those back roads at night, who haven't driven until their mind feels half unhinged, they don't understand how the line between real and unreal can blur. But I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere on a foggy Appalachian road outside Abingdon, she's still waiting for a ride. Story number 2. I was 23 when I first set foot in San Sebastian. I had saved up for months waiting tables back home, and Spain was meant to be a reward to myself after finally graduating. I wasn't traveling with anyone, just a backpack, a rented car, and the vague idea of driving along the northern coast until I grew tired. I had no real plan, and I think that's what drew me into the kind of trouble I never could have imagined. The car I rented was small, nothing fancy, and when I picked it up from the rental office, it looked perfectly ordinary. I threw my bag into the back seat, adjusted the seat, and only when I stopped at my first roadside cafe an hour later did I notice something shoved beneath the passenger seat. It was a book, about the size of a journal, bound in worn leather. My first thought was that it belonged to another tourist, maybe someone who had accidentally left it behind. I almost tossed it into the glove compartment to forget about it, But curiosity won. It wasn't a travel guide or a notebook filled with sketches. It was a diary. The first page had a name, Alberto, written in rushed handwriting. I flipped through quickly, and the entries were all in Spanish. My Spanish wasn't perfect, but I could understand enough. He had written about traveling with friends through the Basque countryside, road trips in an old Peugeot, and nights filled with cheap wine and music. The entries began in the late 1970s, almost 20 years earlier, and as I skimmed, I noticed the tone shift. The cheerful notes about beaches and taverns grew darker, sentences shorter, words harsher. By the time I reached the middle, one entry stopped me cold. It said, roughly translated, "We buried her near the river, under the stones." No one will ever know I sat there in that little cafe, staring at the page as if my eyes were lying. I turned back a few entries to see if I had misunderstood. Before that line, there had been talk of a girl named Marisol, someone they had met in a small town who had joined them for part of their trip. The entries about her began light-hearted, her laughter, her songs, the way she danced in the car when the radio worked. But then came arguments, words like, "She knew too much," and "We couldn't let her talk." And then, that confession. I remember feeling sick, as though the food in front of me had turned to poison. My first instinct was denial. People write strange things in journals. Maybe it was fiction, some dark story he had been creating. But the more I read, the less it felt like fiction. There were too many details. The name of the town, the bend in the road, even the color of her scarf. I could almost follow the trail he had left, as if daring someone decades later to pick it up. I should have closed the book, handed it in at the rental office, and forgotten about it. But I didn't. I was young, reckless, and convinced that I was stumbling into something important. Thought that I might be holding evidence of an actual murder consumed me. That night, in my cheap hostel bed, I couldn't sleep. The words repeated in my head, the way he had written, "We buried her." I kept seeing the name Marisol. I kept wondering if her family had ever found out what happened to her. The next morning, I decided to see if I could find the town he mentioned. It wasn't far, a little inland, nothing I had ever heard of before. When I arrived, it was small, quiet, the kind of place where people still greeted each other on the street. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe to find someone who remembered her, or to see a police notice tacked to a wall. Instead, I found silence. The town square was nearly empty, and when I asked an older man in broken Spanish if he had ever heard of a girl named Marisol who went missing in the late 70s, he stared at me as if I had said something obscene. He shook his head firmly, muttered something I couldn't catch, and walked away. That reaction should have warned me off, but it only deepened my curiosity. I spent the next few hours asking in small shops, bars, anywhere I could. Most people claimed they didn't know anything. A few turned away without answering. Finally, a woman in her 60s leaned in close when I mentioned the name and whispered, "No lo preguntes aquí." Don't ask here. Then she quickly left. I drove out of town unsettled, diary on the passenger seat, and I thought about leaving it behind. But by then, it felt like the diary had chosen me. The entries described a river, a sharp bend in the road, a place where the stones piled naturally. With too much stubbornness for my own good, I decided to look. It took hours of driving, stopping, and checking, but eventually I found a stretch of road that matched his description. The river ran shallow, with scattered rocks along the bank. I parked the car, climbed down, and walked among the stones. At first it seemed ordinary, just another riverside. But then I noticed something. A cluster of rocks larger than the rest, placed in a way that looked deliberate. I stood there frozen, heart pounding. I didn't dig. I didn't have the tools, and the thought of actually unearthing what might be beneath terrified me. But I took photos. I marked the spot in my notebook. The entire time I kept glancing back toward the road, half expecting someone to appear and stop me. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept imagining that someone was following me, though the roads were empty. Every car that appeared in the rearview mirror made my stomach twist. By the time I reached my hostel in another town, I was shaking. I locked the door and sat with the diary open on the bed, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to go to the police, but I had doubts. Would they believe a foreigner showing up with a 20-year-old diary she claimed to have found in a rental car? What if the diary was dismissed as a hoax? Worse, what if the people mentioned in it were still alive, still in that town, and they heard that I was asking questions? The way those locals had looked at me earlier, it felt like they already knew, and they didn't want it disturbed. Sleep was impossible. Every sound in the hallway jolted me. I kept imagining the door handle turning. By dawn, I made a decision. I would leave Spain early. I would take the diary, the photos, and I would give them to the authorities back home, where at least I wouldn't be silenced. But leaving wasn't simple. When I returned the rental car, I hesitated. What if they knew it had been left there? What if the person who abandoned it was connected to the company? The woman at the desk smiled politely as she checked the car over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew exactly what I carried in my bag. On the train to Madrid, I sat with the diary hidden under my clothes, as though someone might try to take it. Every time the train slowed, I thought it was for me. By the time I boarded the plane, my nerves were raw. Back home, I handed the diary and my notes to the authorities. I expected skepticism, maybe even dismissal, but to my surprise, they took it seriously. Weeks later, I received a call confirming that Spanish police were reopening a cold case from the late 70s. A young woman named Marisol had indeed gone missing after last being seen with a group of local men traveling the countryside. Her body had never been recovered. I asked if the site I had found had been searched. They said they couldn't disclose details, but their tone told me enough. The diary was genuine. I should have felt relief, even pride for having brought it forward. But what stayed with me wasn't the satisfaction of uncovering a truth. It was the feeling of being watched, followed, shadowed by people who didn't want me to know. To this day, I don't tell this story often, and when I do, I still lower my voice, as if someone might overhear. I don't know who Alberto was, or what became of him, but sometimes when I'm driving alone, especially on winding roads, I catch myself glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see that diary waiting for me again. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. Story number 3. I was 21 when I left my university dorm in Iyashi, with a backpack half torn at the seams and a mind full of reasons to keep moving. I had grown used to silence, to keeping parts of myself hidden, because in 2001, Romania wasn't exactly a place where someone like me could speak too freely about being transgender. I didn't even have the words for it then, not the way I do now. But I knew who I was, and I knew that every time I looked in the mirror, it was a fight between recognition and fear. That day I just wanted to get away, to stretch my legs and breathe someplace where no one knew me. Hitchhiking was risky, but I had been doing it since I was 17, and by then I trusted the rhythm of the road more than I trusted most people in my city. The first car that stopped was an old Dacia with cracked windows, and the smell of gasoline leaking faintly from its exhaust. 2 men sat in the front, both with thick coats despite the mild day, and when I opened the back door, one of them just nodded without a word. I told them I was heading south, maybe Brasov, maybe farther, and they shrugged like it didn't matter. We drove without much talking for the first hour, the car rattling at every bend, and I began to relax. I told myself that maybe this was going to be one of those quiet rides where the drivers didn't care who I was or what I looked like, just that I wasn't a problem. But then I noticed the plastic containers stacked in the trunk, visible through the gap where the seat should have folded down. At first I thought they were just water or supplies, but the smell grew sharper the longer I sat there. It wasn't water. It was fuel, packed in large canisters, and judging by the way the men stiffened every time we passed a police car, I realized what was happening. They were smugglers, running illegal gasoline through the Carpathian backroads. I told myself to stay calm. People did this all the time back then. I had heard about it, but seeing it up close made my chest tighten. I shifted in my seat, and one of the men, the one driving, glanced back at me for the first time. His eyes were small and watchful, as if he was measuring whether I'd say something. "You don't talk much," he said. "Nothing to say," I answered. The other man chuckled low. "Good. Keep it that way." It was supposed to sound like a joke, but the tone told me it wasn't. We drove another stretch without speaking, the roads curving tighter as the mountains rose around us. My heart thudded each time the car slowed down, expecting to see flashing lights, a checkpoint, anything. But no one stopped us. That's when the first wave of fear began to fade into something heavier. Because if we were caught, maybe I could claim ignorance, maybe I could get out of it. But if we weren't caught, what would they do with me once we got where they were going? At one point, the car pulled off onto a gravel shoulder, and the man in the passenger seat stepped out. He opened the trunk, checked the containers, and then leaned down to me through the open back door. "You hungry?" he asked. I shook my head quickly, though my stomach had been empty since morning. He smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "Smart? Don't eat from strangers." When he shut the door, I realized how trapped I was. Out here, there was no bus, no town, no chance of walking back. I had chosen this, I reminded myself. I had lifted my hand and stepped into their car. The road narrowed, twisting between steep drops and thick woods, and I started to picture all the ways this could end. If I spoke up, if I demanded to be let out, would they just stop and let me walk? Or would they decide I'd seen too much? I remembered the way people at school laughed when they thought I wasn't listening, how quickly small threats could become real ones when someone wanted to put you back in your place. The driver asked me where I was from, and I hesitated before answering. I gave the name of a village instead of Iashi, something forgettable. He nodded slowly, as though filing it away. Then he asked what I studied. I lied again and said history. He grunted approval, but I could feel the suspicion between every question. Hours passed like that. Questions dropped like hooks. My answers clipped short. I thought maybe I could endure it until we reached a larger road where I could make an excuse and get out. But then the passenger leaned close to whisper something to the driver. They didn't think I could hear, but the words carried back. "What if the kid talks?" the driver muttered. "Then we take care of it before the border." I froze. They didn't mean the border with another country. They meant the county border. Before we reached it, before another patrol could see me with them. My hand started to shake in my lap and I tried to hide it, pressing them between my knees. I needed a plan, but my mind was a blur. I thought of my father's voice telling me I was reckless, that people like me ended up dead in ditches. For once, I feared he might be right. Then luck shifted. The car jerked as one of the tires hit something sharp, a sudden hiss filling the air. The driver cursed and pulled over. They both stepped out, leaving the doors open. I sat there staring at the woods on one side and the drop on the other. I knew this was my chance. I slid out of the car quietly, clutching my bag, and without looking back I walked toward the tree line. Not running, not yet. Just walking, like maybe I was stretching my legs, When I reached the edge of the woods, I heard the driver shout, "Where do you think you're going?" I didn't answer. I bolted into the trees, branches slapping at my arms. Behind me I heard footsteps pounding and voices swearing. I stumbled over rocks and roots but kept moving, lungs burning, heart hammering like it would explode. For minutes that felt like hours I ran, ducking and twisting until the voices faded. I crouched low behind a fallen trunk, chest heaving, and listened. Nothing. Just silence. My whole body trembled as I tried to decide what to do next. Going back to the road was suicide. Staying in the woods meant freezing before long. I waited until I was sure they had given up, then moved slowly downhill, keeping to the shadows. After what must have been another hour, I stumbled onto a dirt track that led to a cluster of houses. Relief nearly made me collapse. I knocked on the first door I found, and an old woman answered, staring at me like I was a ghost. I told her my name, the false village name I had given earlier, and begged for help. She let me inside, gave me water, and after some convincing agreed to call a cousin with a cart to take me back toward the main town. I didn't tell her about the smugglers. Not then. Fear sealed my mouth tighter than loyalty ever could. When I returned to Iashi the next day, no one knew what had happened. I went back to my classes, back to pretending I was just another student passing through life unnoticed. But something had shifted inside me. I had looked at death close enough to feel its breath on my neck, and I had walked away. Months later, I read in the paper about a police raid on fuel smugglers caught in the same region. 2 men arrested. I didn't recognize the names, but I didn't need to. I already carried their faces in my memory, the sound of their voices warning me to stay quiet. Even now, years later, I think about that road. I think about the choice I made to climb into that car, and the choice I made to run when I could. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the tire hadn't blown, if I had hesitated a second longer. But mostly, I think about how thin the line is between survival and disappearance, how easily someone like me could vanish without a trace. And I carry the truth of it still, that fear doesn't always end when you escape. It lingers, follows, reshapes you. I tell this not because I want pity, but because it is the most real thing that ever happened to me. I lived through it, and that's the only reason I can tell it now. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. Story number 4. I should not have left home that morning. But at 10 years old, I believed I was destined for something greater than school, chores, and the endless shouting of my father. I had heard stories of the monks in Rishikesh, how they lived in silence, free from anger and pain, and I thought if I could reach them, I would never have to return. So, with only a small cloth bag and the little money I had saved from errands, I slipped out before sunrise and began walking the road that wound into the Himalayan foothills. I told myself it was a pilgrimage, that the gods were watching, but really I was just a scared boy trying to escape. The road stretched ahead of me longer than I expected. Cars and buses passed now and then, but I was too shy to ask for a ride, afraid they would send me back. My legs grew tired quickly, but I kept reminding myself that monks walked everywhere, and if I wanted to be like them, I had to learn endurance. I had eaten nothing since the night before, but the excitement in my chest overpowered my hunger. I hummed little prayers I had memorized from temple visits, hoping they would protect me. By afternoon, I had wandered far enough that I no longer recognized the villages. That was both thrilling and terrifying. The unfamiliarity proved I was truly on my way, but it also meant I couldn't turn back easily. Around then, I noticed a man walking behind me on the same road. He looked old, his hair wild, his clothes ragged. At first I thought he was just another traveler, but after a while I realized he had been keeping pace with me for nearly an hour. Every time I glanced back, he smiled strangely, as if amused that I had noticed. I quickened my steps. He quickened his too. I turned into a smaller path that I thought might lead to a shortcut, hoping to lose him. But when I dared to glance back again, there he was, still smiling. My stomach clenched in fear. I told myself not to panic, that perhaps it was a coincidence, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I darted into a grove of trees and crouched low, holding my breath. For a while, nothing moved. I waited until my knees ached, then slowly rose, thinking maybe he had gone. That's when I heard it. A soft chuckle right behind me. I spun, and he was there, so close his eyes seemed to swallow me whole. "You're too young to be alone," he said, voice rasping like stones scraping together. "Where are you going?" I didn't answer. My throat had gone dry. I clutched my bag and bolted. My feet slipped on the uneven ground, but fear gave me speed. I didn't dare look back. I ran until my chest burned and my vision blurred. Finally, when I stumbled onto the road again, the man was nowhere in sight. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break. I told myself I was safe now, that he couldn't possibly keep following forever. But deep down, I wasn't sure. As the day faded, my hunger became unbearable. I found a roadside stall and spent some of my coins on flatbread. The vendor eyed me suspiciously but said nothing. I sat on a rock to eat, and for a moment the world felt normal again. I imagined myself reaching Rishikesh, meeting a kind guru who would praise my determination. I even laughed quietly at my own fear, thinking maybe the old man had just been crazy and harmless. That comfort lasted only until night fell. Without money for lodging, I decided to sleep beneath a cluster of trees near the road. The ground was cold and hard, but I curled up and tried to rest. Sleep came in broken fragments, each one disturbed by sounds that seemed too close. The crunch of footsteps, the snap of twigs, the faintest laugh drifting in the dark. I told myself it was only my imagination, yet every time I opened my eyes, I expected to see him standing there. At one point, I woke to a whisper directly in my ear. No one was there, but I leapt up, trembling, and refused to lie down again. The next morning, exhaustion weighed on me like stones. I forced myself onward, thinking that daylight would erase the night's terror. But halfway up a steep bend, I saw something that drained the strength from my legs. On the dirt ahead of me lay a small cloth bag, identical to mine, down to the patch my mother had sewn on it. For a second I thought I had dropped mine, but no. Mine was still slung across my shoulder. I bent down slowly, too scared to touch it. Inside were scraps of food, exactly like the ones I had eaten the day before. My chest tightened, and I left it lying there, walking faster than before. The further I went, the less the road seemed like a path to salvation, and more like a trap. I could feel eyes on me even when the road was empty. Sometimes I thought I heard my name being called in my mother's voice, but when I stopped, there was only silence. Other times, a shadow seemed to move just ahead, luring me forward. By evening, I was so exhausted I could hardly think straight. That's when I saw him again. He was standing on the roadside, waiting as though he knew I'd pass that way. His smile was wider now, almost mocking. He lifted the same cloth bag I had seen earlier and waved it like a prize. "Hungry?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't run either. I just stood frozen, my legs refusing to obey me. He walked closer, his steps slow and deliberate. "You won't make it to Rishikesh," he said softly, "but you'll come with me." The road always takes what it wants. Something inside me snapped. I screamed as loudly as I could and hurled my own bag at him. Then I ran. This time I didn't stop. Not when my lungs burned, not when my vision swam. I ran until I stumbled into a roadside temple, collapsing at the feet of a startled priest. Through gasps and sobs, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words tangled in fear. The priest didn't ask many questions. He simply pulled me inside, locked the gate, and told me to rest. That night I slept on the temple floor, surrounded by the faint chanting of prayers. For the first time in days, I felt safe. When morning came, the priest pressed food into my hands and told me he would send someone to escort me home. I wanted to protest, to insist that I was meant to reach Rishikesh, but when I stepped outside, I saw something scratched into the dirt by the gate, a single line written in shaky letters spelling my name. My heart sank. Whatever had followed me was still out there, waiting. I didn't argue anymore. I let the priest's assistant lead me back. It took nearly a week before I dared to step outside my house again. My father never knew where I had gone, only that I had run away. He beat me once for the trouble I caused, but even that pain felt small compared to what I had escaped. At night, though, I often woke sweating, convinced I heard that same dry chuckle outside my window. I never told anyone, not even my mother, about the bag, the whispers, or the man who seemed to know my name. Some things, I decided, could not be explained. Years have passed since then, but sometimes when I'm alone on a quiet road, the memory comes back so vividly I can almost hear him walking just behind me. I don't know if he was real, or if the road itself had conjured him to test me. What I do know is this: I never reached Rishikesh, and I never tried again. The road didn't want me to. And even now, I feel it hasn't finished with me yet. Story number 5. I had been on the road for hours, drifting from one small Balkan town to the next, my car carrying everything I owned, and my thoughts running in circles that never seemed to stop. I wasn't really going anywhere in particular, just driving to feel distance between me and the memories that clung to me like a second skin. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the edge of a narrow road near Plevlia, one arm raised, the other clutching a small bag to her chest. There was no hesitation in her eyes when I slowed down. She yanked open the door and climbed in, as if she had been waiting for me specifically. "Please," she said in a low voice, not looking at me. "Drive." Her urgency wasn't something I could ignore. I pressed my foot down, the car groaning as we picked up speed. She was breathing hard, shaking, though she tried to steady herself. I didn't ask questions right away because I recognized the look. Someone who had been through something ugly, someone running. I'd seen it before in the faces of people in places torn apart by violence. After a few minutes, when her breathing calmed slightly, I asked her name. "Milena," she said, her voice thin. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. "I'm Armin." We drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. Then, just as I was about to ask where she wanted to go, I noticed headlights appear in the rearview mirror. They were too close, moving too fast. Her hand gripped the edge of the seat so tightly her knuckles whitened. "It's him," she whispered. "Who?" "My husband." I didn't need more explanation. Her fear was real, raw, and absolute. I had seen men like him before, men who thought possession was the same as love, men who hurt because they could. I pressed harder on the gas, feeling the old car strain. "Why is he after you?" I asked, though the answer didn't matter much at that point. She swallowed hard. "I left. I couldn't take it anymore. He doesn't forgive." The headlights behind us grew larger, brighter, until they flooded the inside of the car with pale light. He wasn't just following. He was closing in. My pulse quickened, Not from fear exactly, but from the old instinct that always came back when danger was near. The war had taught me to recognize when someone was hunting, and this man was hunting. He rammed the back of my car once, hard enough to make the steering wheel jump in my hands. Milena cried out, bracing herself against the dashboard. "Hold on," I said through clenched teeth. The road twisted through the hills, narrow and unforgiving. If I lost control, we'd be finished. But slowing down meant giving him the advantage. He rammed us again, the sound of metal grinding metal echoing inside my head. I forced the car forward, taking the next curve so sharply the tires squealed. He kept on us, relentless. "Does he have a weapon?" I asked. She nodded quickly, eyes wide. "Always. A pistol and a knife good." At least I knew what we were dealing with. Better to expect the worst than be surprised by it. I thought of pulling over, confronting him right there, ending it before it escalated further. But Milena's face stopped me. There was too much desperation there, too much trust. She wasn't just hoping I would drive. She was depending on me to save her. That kind of responsibility burned in my chest. I took a sharp turn toward a smaller road, hoping he wouldn't follow. He did. His headlights stayed locked on us like the eyes of a predator. I could feel the car shudder with every uneven stretch of asphalt. "Armin," Milena said suddenly, her voice trembling. "If he catches us, he'll kill you too." I glanced at her. "Then we don't let him catch us." But the truth was, I could already feel how far this would go. Men like him didn't give up. They had to be stopped, one way or another. He rammed us again, harder this time, sending the car veering toward the edge. I fought the wheel with every ounce of strength, keeping us steady. Adrenaline surged through me, sharpening everything, narrowing the world down to the road, the car, the man behind us. "Does he know where you were going?" I asked. "No," she said quickly. "I just ran." I didn't think, I just ran, her voice cracked on the last word. I spotted a stretch of road up ahead that widened slightly. Without thinking too much about it, I slammed the brakes. His car shot past us, his headlights swinging wild across the hills. Before he could recover, I swung behind him and accelerated, ramming him in return. The jolt rattled my bones, but it did the job. He lost control for a split second, enough for me to swerve past him. Milena stared at me, shocked. "You're crazy." "Maybe," I muttered, "but it worked." For a few precious minutes, we gained ground. I thought maybe we could lose him in the switchbacks ahead. But then his lights returned, closer than ever, as if nothing had happened. The man was relentless. "He'll never stop," Milena said, almost to herself. Her words sank deep because I knew they were true. He wouldn't stop unless something stopped him. I pulled the car to the side suddenly, tires screeching. Milena gasped, grabbing my arm. "What are you doing?" "Ending this," I said. Before she could argue, I stepped out of the car. The other vehicle skidded to a halt just a few meters away. The door slammed open, and he stepped out, gun already in his hand. He was broad-shouldered, face twisted with rage. His voice carried across the space between us. "She's mine." "No," I said evenly, every nerve in my body ready. "She isn't." The gun lifted. I dove to the side as he fired. The shot cracked the night, echoing through the hills. Milena screamed inside the car. I hit the ground hard, rolling, and by the time I came up, I had a rock in my hand. Instinct. Pure instinct. He aimed again, but he was too focused on me. I hurled the rock with everything I had. It struck his wrist, the gun clattering to the ground. He cursed, clutching his arm. I didn't hesitate. I ran at him, tackled him before he could recover. We hit the ground, both of us struggling, thrashing, fists connecting with flesh. He was strong, fueled by anger, but I had fought men stronger and meaner than him before. My knee pressed into his chest as I wrapped my hands around his throat. For a moment his eyes widened, and I saw fear crack through his fury. "Stop!" Milena cried behind me, her voice cut through the red haze in my head. I let go, breathing hard, every muscle screaming at me. He rolled onto his side, coughing. I grabbed the gun before he could reach it and pointed it at him. "Leave," I said, my voice low, steady. "If I ever see you again, you won't walk away." His eyes burned with hatred, but beneath it, I saw something else. Hesitation. He knew I wasn't bluffing. Slowly, he climbed to his feet, holding his injured wrist close to his chest. He spat at the ground, then backed away, retreating toward his car. I kept the gun trained on him until he was inside, until his headlights faded into the distance. When he was gone, I lowered the gun, my hands trembling. Milena stood near the car, tears streaming down her face. She looked at me as if she wasn't sure what I was, savior, stranger, or something in between. I tossed the gun into the woods. I didn't want it, not anymore. We got back into the car. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The engine hummed, the road stretched ahead, but all I could hear was the echo of her husband's voice, the crack of the gunshot, the sound of my own heartbeat hammering inside my chest. Finally, Milena whispered, "Thank you." I nodded, not trusting myself to answer. I drove her to a town further down the road, a place where she said she had a cousin. She hugged me before she left, her arms tight around me, then walked away without looking back. I sat there for a while, watching until she disappeared from sight. My body ached, my knuckles were split, and my thoughts were heavier than they had been in years. But one thing was clear. She was free now. And maybe, just maybe, so was I. Story number 6. I had been on the road for nearly 2 days when I first saw him. I was standing by the side of a narrow highway outside Tromsø, backpack leaning against my leg, thumb out in the half-hearted way of someone who is both desperate and cautious. Cars had been rare all morning. When the pickup finally pulled over, I felt a mix of relief and hesitation, the kind that always hits when you realize you're about to get in a stranger's vehicle with no idea who they are. The driver leaned across and pushed the door open. He was a broad man, rough features under a wool cap, dressed in thick layers with a faint smell of smoke and leather. He nodded for me to climb in, saying little more than, "Where you headed?" I told him I was trying to get further north, toward Alta. He just gave a grunt and shifted the truck back onto the road. I noticed ropes and canvas piled in the back seat, and antlers, real antlers, resting against the glass of the rear window. He explained in a flat voice that he was a reindeer herder, and I believed him instantly. His voice had the calm, matter-of-fact tone of someone who lived with animals and weather rather than people. At first, I thought I'd gotten lucky. Someone who worked with reindeer was likely trustworthy, maybe even kind. I didn't realize then how quickly trust could twist into something else. The first odd thing he said came not long after. We'd been driving in silence, the snow hissing softly beneath the tires, when he asked, "You ever hear about the tourists who go missing around here?" His voice was almost casual, like mentioning the price of fuel. I froze for a second, unsure how to answer. I muttered that I'd read something in a guidebook about accidents, people getting lost in the snow. He chuckled, a dry sound that didn't match the words. "Accidents," he said. "That's what they call it." He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask. But the way he smiled without looking at me made my skin prickle. I tried to steady myself, telling myself he was just one of those men who liked to spook travelers with local folklore. Still, I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. I kept glancing at the door handle, reassuring myself that if I needed to, I could jump out. The roads were empty, though, and I knew if I left the warmth of the truck, I'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. So I stayed, pretending to relax, nodding when he talked about the reindeer herds and the long seasons. His words drifted in and out, but I kept noticing how often he circled back to the subject of strangers disappearing. At one point, he slowed the truck and pulled over, claiming he needed to check something in the back. My pulse quickened. He stepped out, boots crunching, and disappeared around the side. I sat, frozen, listening. A thought flashed through my mind. I should grab my bag and run. But before I could move, he returned, wiping his hands on a rag, saying something about a loose tarp. The way he looked at me as he climbed back in made me certain he knew I'd considered fleeing. His eyes lingered too long, as if measuring whether I had the courage to act. We drove on. Hours passed in a haze of nerves. Then he asked if I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since early morning, and the mention of food made my stomach twist. He reached under the seat and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was dried meat, strips of something dark and tough. He offered me one. I hesitated but didn't want to offend him. I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow while my mind spun with questions. What exactly was I eating? I couldn't taste much, but the thought of asking what it was seemed dangerous. As the day faded, he told me we wouldn't make Alta before nightfall. He said he had a cabin nearby where I could rest. The way he phrased it, like it wasn't a suggestion, made my blood run cold. I smiled weakly and said that sounded fine, though inside I was screaming at myself. I wanted to insist on being dropped at the next town, but there was no next town in sight. Just road stretching into emptiness. We turned off the main route onto a smaller path, barely more than a track. My chest tightened with every curve we took away from civilization. Eventually, a small cabin appeared, tucked against the edge of the trees. He parked and gestured for me to follow. I reminded myself that panicking too soon could make things worse. Inside, the cabin was simple. Wood stove, table, bedrolls, no electricity. He lit a lantern and told me to sit. The silence inside was unbearable. He moved with slow certainty, taking off his outer layers, humming under his breath. Finally, he spoke. "You're lucky, you know. Most tourists, they don't get this far." His eyes gleamed in the lantern light. My hands clenched under the table, trying not to shake. I forced myself to ask, "What do you mean?" He tilted his head, studying me. "People think the snow takes them, but sometimes it's not the snow." My heart hammered so hard I thought he could hear it. I realized then that I couldn't wait for him to reveal more. If I stayed, I might not leave at all. I scanned the room quickly. The door was behind him, but the window was close to my side of the table. I decided. I nodded as if interested in his story, then suddenly pushed back the chair and lunged for the window. The sound of the chair scraping startled him for just a moment, but it was enough. I slammed my shoulder into the wooden frame, glass shattering as I tumbled out into the snow. Pain shot through my arm, but I scrambled up, grabbing my backpack as he shouted behind me. I ran. My legs sank deep into the drifts, slowing me, but fear kept me moving. I could hear him inside, cursing, then the door banging open. His heavy boots pounded after me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath tearing my chest. I don't know how far I got before I saw the lights of another vehicle on the road ahead. It was like a miracle, headlights cutting through the dark. I waved wildly, stumbling toward it. The car slowed, a middle-aged couple inside staring at me in shock. They rolled down the window, and I begged them to let me in, words tumbling over themselves. They saw the terror in my face and unlocked the doors instantly. I climbed in, shaking uncontrollably. When I glanced back, the herder was standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the headlights. He didn't move closer, just watched as we pulled away. His face was blank, unreadable, but his stillness was more terrifying than if he'd lunged. The couple kept asking me what had happened, but I couldn't form a proper answer. All I could say was, he wasn't going to let me go. We drove until we reached the next town, where they insisted on calling the police. I gave a shaky account, though I left out parts I couldn't explain, like the way he seemed to enjoy drawing out my fear. The officers listened politely but didn't seem surprised. They said some travelers did vanish now and then, that the wilderness could be cruel. They promised to check the area, but I knew from their eyes they didn't expect to find anything. That night, I stayed at a small inn, too frightened to sleep. Every sound outside made me flinch. I kept picturing him standing there, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, waiting. I wondered how many others had accepted his offer of a ride and never made it back. I left Norway soon after, cutting my trip short. For years, I couldn't talk about it without trembling. Even now, when I tell the story, people ask if maybe I misread the situation, if maybe he was just a lonely man trying to help. But I know what I saw in his eyes. I know the way he tightened control of the situation, the way he spoke about missing tourists like trophies. Sometimes, when I think back, what chills me most isn't the chase or the shattered window, or even his voice in the cabin. It's that moment on the road when I turned back and saw him standing there, calm, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Like he knew another traveler would come along and he could try again. I survived because I ran, because luck put another car on that road at the exact right moment. But not everyone is lucky. And when people say the wilderness swallows the lost, I can't help but remember his smile and think, sometimes it's not the wilderness at all. Story number 7. I had never been the kind of person who believed in fate or strange encounters, but what happened to me back in 1986 on a road outside Kandy still keeps me awake some nights, wondering whether I lost my mind that day or brushed against something no one should ever experience. I was 23, restless, and carrying nothing more than a second-hand duffel bag, and the idea that traveling across Sri Lanka's hill country would shake loose the sense of uselessness I had been feeling since finishing university. My parents thought I was wasting time, but I told myself it was only a few weeks of wandering before I would return and get serious about life. The road leading out of Kandy twisted endlessly, and after an hour of walking I was tired enough to consider turning back. It wasn't a tourist season, so buses weren't running as often, and I didn't have enough money for the private taxis I saw every so often zipping by. That's when I noticed someone standing at the bend ahead, leaning against a low wall like he had been waiting for me. I slowed instinctively, not out of fear exactly, but because something about him gave me pause. He was dressed almost identically to me, jeans that were slightly frayed at the knees, a loose white shirt, and the same style of cheap sandals I had bought in town 2 days earlier. He smiled as I got closer. There was nothing threatening about it, but the smile unsettled me because it was the sort of smile you give to someone you already know. "Long walk, isn't it?" he said in Sinhala, his voice carrying a tone I couldn't place, something eerily familiar. I nodded and mumbled an agreement, not wanting to get into a conversation, but he fell into step beside me as if it was the most natural thing. Within a few minutes, he asked me where I was headed, and when I told him vaguely about trying to see some temples outside the city, he nodded like he had been expecting that answer. Then he said something that made me stop in my tracks. "You always say that. I'm just wandering, trying to see something new." "You've been repeating it for years, haven't you?" I stared at him, confused, because those were the exact words I had used to brush off friends who questioned my choices lately. I laughed nervously, trying to make it seem like coincidence. But then he kept going, mentioning my father's temper, my mother's constant worrying, and even the fact that I still carried the tiny notebook where I scribbled useless half-poems I never showed anyone. I hadn't told a soul about that notebook. I asked how he knew all this, and he shrugged, saying, "I know because I've been you. Still am you." It was the sort of statement that makes you want to walk faster, put distance between yourself and a lunatic. But my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear away because deep down I realized his face wasn't just similar to mine. It was mine. Older, lined with exhaustion I hadn't earned yet, but undeniably mine. I whispered, "You're not real." He didn't argue. He just smiled again, almost sadly, and said, "Real enough to warn you." From that moment, the walk was no longer casual. Every step I took beside him felt like a step toward unraveling. He told me things about the next decade of my life, how I would keep running from responsibilities, how I would let friendships collapse because I couldn't commit, how I would end up in a dead-end job back in Colombo wishing I had made different choices. He said I would marry briefly, half-heartedly, and ruin it through neglect. He even told me about the car accident that would leave a scar across my shoulder in 1993. I demanded proof, and he simply pulled down the collar of his shirt. There it was, the scar, jagged and pale, exactly where I would later receive mine. My stomach turned cold. I wanted to accuse him of trickery, but there was no trick that could mimic that so perfectly. As we walked, he began to grow more intense, his voice urgent. "You have to turn back now. Don't go down this road. Don't go chasing the same hollow ideas. Go home, start something different. If you don't, you'll end up exactly like me, and you won't like the man you become." I tried to argue, but I sounded weak even to myself. He knew me too well. Every excuse I gave, he finished before I could. It was like arguing with my own thoughts given form. By then, the road was nearly empty, and it hit me that no one else seemed to notice him. A lorry passed us, and the driver glanced at me but didn't acknowledge the man beside me. I asked, "Do they see you?" He looked down and didn't answer. That silence said more than words. I felt something shift in me. Fear, yes, but also rage. If this was truly me from the future, why had he come here? Why burden me with knowledge that only suffocated me? I shouted, "Then why bother? If I can't change, if you're proof that I don't change, then what's the point?" He stopped walking and looked directly at me, and the weariness in his eyes was worse than any horror movie I'd ever seen. Because I remember this moment. I remember not listening. I remember walking away. And I've regretted it every day since those words hit me harder than any threat. I realized I was standing at a crossroad, not just physically but in every sense. He stretched out his hand like he was begging me to stop, but something rebellious surged in me. Maybe I couldn't handle being told my future was set. Maybe I just wanted to prove him wrong. I shoved his hand away and kept walking, faster this time, not daring to look back. For a while I thought he followed, but when I turned around, the road was empty. I reached the small town I had planned to visit, sat on a cracked stone bench, and shook so badly I could barely light a cigarette. I told myself I was imagining things, maybe dehydrated, maybe losing my mind from too much walking. But when I opened my duffel bag to take out the notebook, I found something inside that hadn't been there before. A folded slip of paper with my own handwriting on it, older, sloppier, but unmistakably mine. The note read, "You won't believe me now, but you will remember this scar." 7 years later, in 1993, I was in a car that skidded off a wet road just outside Colombo. The doorframe tore into my shoulder, leaving a long scar that still aches when I move my arm too quickly. When the doctor unwrapped the bandages weeks later, I thought back to that road in Candy and nearly collapsed. I wanted to scream that I had seen it coming, that I had been warned. But who would have believed me? Now decades have passed, and sometimes I wonder whether I am slowly becoming the man I met. I never married, though I came close once. My friendships have drifted. I work a job I don't love. I still carry the notebook, though I've long since stopped writing in it. Every so often, when I catch my reflection in a shop window, I see the same weary eyes I saw in him. In me. I tell myself I can still change, that meeting him was a chance, not a sentence. But when I walk alone on mountain roads or quiet streets, I feel like any corner I turn, I might see him again, waiting for me, knowing every excuse I'll give before I open my mouth. And the most terrifying part is that if I do see him again, I'm not sure I'll have the strength to walk away a second time. Story number 8. I was 7 years old the day it happened, and for most of my life I tried to convince myself it had just been a dream, some distorted childhood memory that never truly occurred. But memory has a way of sticking in places you don't expect, like small shards of glass buried under the skin. Even after decades, they hurt when pressed. That bus ride through the Peruvian Andes in 1978 was one of those shards, and as much as I wanted to bury it, it never went away. My parents had taken me on a trip from Cusco to visit family further north. The bus was crowded, filled with villagers, farmers, and travelers like us. I remember sitting next to the window, with my mother pressed beside me, and my father across the aisle. We were passing through endless mountain roads, sharp turns where the wheels seemed inches from the drop. I was used to my father's occasional nervous glances out the window, but that day he looked more tense than usual. I remember the way he gripped the armrest, his knuckles pale. The part that never left me was the tunnel. We came to it late in the afternoon. It wasn't particularly long, as far as mountain tunnels go. Just a rough hollow carved through rock, unlit, the kind of thing you drive through in less than a minute. I leaned against my mother, half asleep, when the bus entered the tunnel. I can still recall the sound, the engine echoing off stone walls, the tires rumbling over uneven ground. Then it all changed. There was a moment of silence, not natural silence, but a sudden drop, as though all the sounds had been sucked out. The chatter of passengers stopped. Even the hum of the engine vanished. I looked around, wide awake now, but no one moved, no one spoke. My mother's hand, which had been stroking my hair, froze in place. My father stared straight ahead, stiff as a statue. The darkness in that tunnel seemed endless, though we should have been out of it in seconds. I remember pulling on my mother's sleeve, whispering, "Why aren't we out yet?" But she didn't answer. I don't remember anything after that. Just a jump, like when a film reel skips. The next clear image is me standing on the side of the road outside the tunnel, alone. No bus, no parents, no passengers, just me, trembling with dust on my clothes and no idea how I'd gotten there. They found me hours later, wandering down the road. A farmer on a donkey spotted me and brought me to the nearest police station. I told them I had been on a bus, that my parents were inside, that everyone had gone into the tunnel with me. They searched, of course. A whole convoy of police and locals combed that road and the mountainsides. They found no bus, no bodies, not even tire tracks leading out of the tunnel. For years, I lived with relatives, bouncing between cousins and uncles who whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. The poor boy. The cursed tunnel. He's lucky to be alive. No one ever gave me answers. The official story was that the bus must have tumbled down a ravine and been lost in some remote gorge. But there were no broken trees, No wreckage, no sign of anything. It was as if the bus had never existed. I tried to forget. I built a life away from Peru, away from those roads. I studied, worked, eventually moved abroad. But the memory followed me. Every now and then I'd wake in the night, convinced I was still sitting inside that tunnel, waiting for the bus to emerge. As I grew older, the dream sharpened instead of fading. By the time I turned 50, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know the truth. In 2020, I flew back to Cusco for the first time since childhood. The city had changed, but the roads out into the mountains remained much the same. I rented a car and drove the same route I remembered. It took hours, but eventually I found it. The tunnel. Smaller than I remembered, but that's childhood for you. I parked the car and walked up to it. It was still unlit, carved through stone, just wide enough for a bus. My hands shook as I touched the cold rock at its edge. I told myself I was being foolish, that I was chasing ghosts, but the need inside me pushed me forward. I walked into the tunnel on foot. The echo of my steps bounced around me. Halfway through, I stopped. The air felt thick, and I swear I could hear something faint, the murmur of voices, the low growl of an engine, all distant but unmistakable. My heart slammed in my chest. I called out, "Mama? Papa?" The sound grew clearer. A light flared ahead, not my flashlight, but the dull yellow glow of bus headlights. I froze. Out of the darkness, a bus emerged, rattling forward as if it had just entered. I recognized it immediately. The faded paint, the crack in the windshield, it was the very bus from 1978. Inside, the seats were filled with passengers. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, mouths open but silent. My mother was there, her hand raised as if mid-motion to comfort me. My father stared straight ahead. None of them moved. None of them breathed. I stumbled backward, but the bus rolled past me without touching the ground, floating inches above it. It moved in silence, though the headlights glared. I ran after it, shouting, but it passed straight through the tunnel wall, vanishing into stone. The voices faded with it. I stood there, gasping, unable to believe what I'd seen. But then something caught my eye. A torn piece of cloth on the ground, dusty and brittle. I picked it up, and recognition hit me like a blow. It was a scrap from my mother's shawl, the one she'd been wearing that day. It was real. That night, I stayed in a small inn in the nearby village. I barely slept, my mind turning the memory over and over. I knew I couldn't just walk away. If I had found one trace, there had to be more. The next morning, I went back with tools, a lantern, rope, a small pickaxe I'd bought from a hardware stall. I told myself I'd search the tunnel wall where the bus had disappeared. Hours passed as I tapped along the stone, listening for any hollow sound. Finally, behind a section near the end, the rock crumbled easier than it should have. My heart leapt. I cleared the loose stones until a gap appeared. Cold air rushed out, carrying the faint smell of rust and oil. I widened the hole until I could squeeze through. Inside was a hidden cavern, larger than the tunnel itself. And there, resting at an angle as if frozen in time, was the bus. Rusted, decayed, but unmistakably the same one. The windows were clouded with dirt, but through them I could make out the shapes of bodies, still seated, untouched. My parents among them. My knees buckled. For decades I'd imagined them lost, buried, gone. But here they were, preserved in some hidden place no one had found. I forced the bus door open, though it shrieked with rust. Inside, the air was stale. The passengers sat exactly as I remembered, their faces dried to leathery masks. My mother's hand still rested mid-air, as if trying to reach for me. My father's eyes stared forward, lifeless but fixed. I broke down then, sobbing in the aisle of that forgotten bus. All the years of questions, all the nights of wondering, and here was the answer. Horrific, final, undeniable. I don't know how the bus ended up sealed inside the mountain. I don't know if it was a landslide that trapped them, or something beyond nature. But I knew the truth. They hadn't vanished into thin air. They'd been waiting here, in the dark, all this time. I reported what I'd found to the authorities, though I left out the part about seeing the bus drive past me in the tunnel. They wouldn't have believed it anyway. Excavation crews arrived within days. The news made headlines briefly. Lost bus of 1978 found in Andes Cavern. Families came to claim what was left of their loved ones. My parents were finally given a burial. Standing at their graves, I felt both relief and sorrow. The mystery was over, but closure doesn't erase grief. Even now, I sometimes dream of that moment in the tunnel, the headlights cutting through the dark, my mother frozen in her last motion. I tell myself I found the truth, that I can move on. But part of me still wonders what I really saw that day. Because if the bus was trapped behind stone all those years, then what was it that drove past me, glowing and silent, before I ever broke through the wall?